Good morning and welcome, folks. Thank you for joining me. I'm glad to be here with you with this session. We're going to get started. Today's agenda is actually to go over the objective of the session, what we're covering in today's demo, to do some developer resources, and to write some code. And next slide. All right, so the objective is to find DocuSign developer access tokens, and we find these by using our APIs. And the reason why I wanted to give this talk was because I felt like there was a gap in how we were actually sharing and displaying this process and concept. Normally, we would use the developer center, and you would find through the developer studies when developers are using the center that they would struggle and hiccup with actually getting the access tokens generated. And so it seemed like a great idea to have this talk to show you the soup to nuts process and mechanisms to getting it going. Next slide. So today specifically, what we're going to be doing is, and I know Sumon did an excellent job in the prior demo of showing this, but I'm going to show a couple of different concepts with creating that DocuSign developer account and specifically going over authentication concepts on the apps and keys page and talking about what different things do. We're also going to be building a Json Web Token based authentication script using Node.js. It's going to just be a quick console application. I'm not going to have a complicated web server or do any specific API calls. As I said, the goal is to mainly get you an access token. And we are actually then from there going to be doing an introductory API call to get your account ID, which you'll find is actually a prerequisite for most API calls going forward as a required parameter. We may not have some time at the end, but if we do, we'll do some quick Q&A. But I wanted you to know that there will also be a dedicated QA session at the end of this as well that you can save your questions for at that point in time as well. Next slide. So just wanted to preemptively give you this and show you that they do have these resources here. I will be going over some of them over the course of this talk. However, they will be available for you on these slides. And I just want you to see that these will be here for you at a point later. Particularly the demo that I'm writing today is actually already going to be available on GitHub. That will be accessible to you once this is done. I'll actually unlock that session. Next slide. All right, so we're going to go ahead and write some code. So if I could have you pass host privileges back to me, please. There we go. All right, and so to get started, I actually wanted to, like I said, show you the process. So we're going to go ahead and create a developer account from scratch. John. Oh, and then let's see, on this plus on. All right, then who I like to call myself. So let's get that started. And that's going to send an account activation email, as you saw before. So we're going to go ahead and activate this email. And this is actually going to load on a separate window, so you don't have to worry about that. That's it. All right. So we've activated this account. And what's really nice is it's actually kind of already like logging us in behind the scenes. So you actually can click that, and clicking log in, it'll actually use a cookie to kind of log you in. So that was kind of cool. So let's go ahead and click on My Apps and Keys. And that's like a nice shortcut that's already going to be loaded into the Developer Center. But to actually get to this, normally you would just click on Settings, and then you would click on Apps and Keys down here. All right. Move this out of the way. Okay, so ultimately, the apps and keys page, some things you're going to want to know and take note of. Your account ID, this is actually a short form integer value of it. That's good to have for troubleshooting and dev support reasons and purposes. I won't be using it in the demo, but I just thought it was important to have and share and point out. You'll have the user ID, which is a GUID, and you have an account ID, which is a GUID. And immediately early on, I was wondering, why are these two separate things here? They really don't make sense that we have, why not just have one single thing? And the reason why it's important to have these two separate values is because this is actually a solution for a multi-tenant style situation. I had a great blog post that was written by Inbar guys. He's also was the manager on our developer center team, and it actually points out here that in a large organization like DocuSign, you'll have different accounts that can be an umbrella account, which is an organization, and that organization can house different individual accounts. And within those individual accounts, you can actually have different users that are all associated to those different organizations. And so in this image here, they're noted as members. However, for the context of what we're working with, they're actually, it's going to be the API account ID is the equivalent of what that user is here. And then, I'm sorry, of the member here. And the user is actually the user ID. And so ultimately for our integration, we're going to need the user ID for what we're going to be working with to actually gain access to this account and use it. The base path is ultimately the part of the API call that's going to be the front of that call, and that will change based on if you're in production or demo. Because this is a developer account and it's always by default always going to be a demo account, this base path is going to be demo@docusign.net. Once we set up an integration and get that integration approved and promote it to production, this base path will change, and this account type, I believe, changes as well to support that. So let's get this going and start a new integration, shall we? So we're going to name it Tally Customer Portal, because why not? We're going to create this app. And so let's go ahead and start taking down some of these values here for later. So right away, we're going to want this integration key because that identifies what we are. And I say, let's take a step back for a second, because maybe you're not developer oriented and you're like, what is all this? So APIs are application programming interfaces. This allows you a way and a means to be able to work with DocuSign accounts and DocuSign assets without actually using a username and a password. Consider it a machine-generated credential with a shelf life, like a coffee or a slice of pizza. After a certain period of time, that access token, which is like your password, will go bad and will need to be regenerated because it was generated by a machine. And this is sort of a secure way that you can have your applications and programs talk to other applications and programs on the internet with access tokens and API keys. So this integration key identifies the actual integration that we're creating. So let's save that for later and note that that's the integration key. And let's now talk about the different types of authentication types. So typically there's two different types that we commonly use here at DocuSign. There's one that's called Authorization Code Grant Authentication, and another that's called JWT, which stands for Json Web Token Authentication. Ultimately, user application authentication is great for when you want to have the user log into the account and you want to consistently have them log into the account. Whereas with the service integration, you may want to not necessarily have the user log into the account every single time. You may want to act on behalf of or impersonate that user. However, keep in mind that doing a service integration like this, you will still need to actually have very first time consent because by the way and nature of how OAuth works, when providing those scopes, I still need to have that user know that, hey, these new things are happening. Will you give permissions for me to do these new actions? It happens very often whenever you sign up for an access or service using Google. You'll see that prompt that has your avatar image asking if you would like to confirm. And that's exactly the same thing when we're talking about granting authorization consent. So let's get this going. We're not going to be using a secret key. Secret key is what you'll be using for authorization code grant. You'll notice with implicit grant, you actually don't need to worry about that either. But as I said, let's generate that RSA key pair. So this is actually using an RSA key to act as a credential in tandem with your integration key. Now, let's close that. So that's there, that's good to go. Now let's also add a redirect URI. Now the redirect URI isn't necessarily used for JWT on its own. It's ultimately used for the consent URL. When we log in and need to use the consent URL, we need to have an appropriate redirect URI that is applicable. I believe Suman used example.com, which is fantastic. I prefer to use HTTP just because it gives status messages. I'll show you in a moment. That's good to go. And these, I believe, links will appear on that prompt that shows that I will show you here shortly. So you're going to want to make sure to click save. Now, sometimes if you start over and you have no cache or cookies, there'll be a prompt that'll ask you to click accept, and that'll hide that save. So you're going to want to make sure to click that to be able to save it. If you don't click save, but you make those modifications, they may actually not appear. So that's why I'm saying, making this happen and then navigating away from the page, like it actually still goes away. Like it's not necessarily there. Like you need to actually click save for it to commit. I've noticed. All right, so moving on, this is good to go. Let's go back out to the front. And I actually needed to copy this user ID. As you'll see later, this is part of the impersonation user code. So copy that. All right, so that's pretty much everything we needed for the integration side. We're going to go ahead and start building. So as I said, I wanted to use Node.js, and I've actually already done this code earlier. I don't want you to see me just kind of pigeonholing here, trying to figure it out. So I'm actually going to be using a templated file that has some of the stuff that's already kind of pre-canned for us, but ultimately, I kind of just wanted to load it from scratch so you could see that there's no tricks, there's nothing set up behind the scenes. It's all just this. End-to-end and works. We're going to open new command prompt window, and we're actually going to initiate a Node.js project. So we're just going to run npm init to get that going. And I usually just like to press enter a bunch of times because it already pre-fills a lot of this stuff in for me. This index.js is the default, so that's good to go. And you see it created this package.json file. So what we're going to do from here is actually import the libraries we need. And for today's demo, I'm going to be using the eSign SDK, and also the library called Open, so I can easily open links. So we'll do npm install open and DocuSign eSign. And I wouldn't ask you to just do that. What I would have actually suggested you do is to go to like npm itself, right? And to just look up, right? And that's like how I would have looked for it. And then that's how I would have found it. So I just happened to recall it on the fly. So lucky me. Well, that's loading. Let's go ahead and get started to see kind of what's here. So what we're doing, right, is we're going to be importing the DocuSign e-signature SDK. And then we're going to be using file system to be able to access and work with the files on the disk. We're actually going to be saving that private key as a physical file. So let's get that going now, right? Private key. And as I mentioned, this is all going to be available for you at the end of this to view. I didn't necessarily want to reveal it now, though, so you're not just kind of, okay, I have the code. Bye. That's where I'm at with that. So that's there. That's good to go. And FYI, so this security vulnerability, just so you're aware, there is something that we are working on with Passport where it's we are actually updating that. So I want you to know that we are aware of that and working through that. And not to be too concerned about it, but if you are, you can also look through those on GitHub to determine kind of what the details are with it. I believe it has to do with a standard that has been updated that we need to update to the newer version so it reflects those standards. So this is my integration key. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that over into here. And that was retrieved earlier from that apps and keys page, as you saw. Then here's my impersonation GUID. Here. And back to the earlier parts of the code. All right, so what we're doing is we're using this open module, which will use the local web browser for the system, so it's cross-compatible to open links. This exits just to easily and quickly be able to exit out of the program if there's problems. So scopes is ultimately what we're going to be giving to our initial key to be able to determine like what permissions are available. And since we're only using e-signature, we just need to set signature. So let's do that. Remember I mentioned the redirect URI and the integration earlier. Let's go to that right now. Get, and just so you can see what it is, right? Really quickly. It's pretty much just outputs like that. So you can kind of see what is in like the response or headers, and you'll see that in a moment as well. And like I said, we're using something called Json Web Tokens. This is a website, jwt.io, that will give you details about what's going on underneath in the standard. And ultimately what's happening is we're encoding these specific values using the SDK to be able to send this to the API so that we could generate an access token. That's pretty much all that is there. So we need to specify an OAuth base path, and that's actually not the API base path. This is what you actually saw in the apps and keys page. And right, this OAuth base path basically has to do with the account server. So that's going to just be demo. So rather than account, it's going to be account-d.sign. And I'm not sure why, but for whatever specific reason, the OAuth base path has a specific quirk to where it's not looking for this HTTP prepended here. So make sure to not necessarily have that included when doing that this way. All right, so like I was saying, on very first time use with Json Web Token, we actually do need to get authorization consent. And that's actually kind of gone into detail on, on this page here. And I just kind of went into anywhere in the dev center. This is platform 101. Cameron does a great job at maintaining these on our team. And I pretty much looked for consent, and then I found how to obtain individual consent. And this here is where that example login URL is. Coincidentally, this is also the same URL you would use in authorization code grant for that step. So that's what this is here. You'll see response type is code, scope equals scope signature, and then right, and client ID. So now let's go ahead and take a look back at the code here and see if this is actually that same URL, except for we're going to go ahead and string concatenate our OAuth base path, our scopes, and our integration key, and our redirect URI, right? And so then from there, let's start talking about the code. So for this style of application, what I decided to do was to have a global object that I'm just calling DS for DocuSign. And then from there, we're going to assign what you call function expressions to that. And so that you'll be able to call these later at a later point in time in the code. So let's go ahead and start filling these in for you, or for everyone, right? And so let's see, this is what I did. I started with the try catch, right? And then I will do a couple of things here. So we're going to instantiate a new API client, which we imported above as DocuSign. So DocuSign API client, we're going to call it API client. We're going to set that OAuth base path above that account d.docusign.com, and see it's highlighted showing we're not using it. And then from there, what we're going to be doing is we're actually going to import the private key, which we set earlier. We can have it as a string, but you could also have this as an environment variable as well, whatever you'd like. Okay. So now we're gonna do the meat and the bones, meat and potatoes part and show you kind of it. And so what we're doing is we're requesting the JWT user token, right? And this is using async awaits. And what that means is it's asynchronous programming. So you need to have things working in order to where you're waiting for responses to come back so that everything lines up in time so that things aren't mismatched and your computer is waiting for the response to be returned from the network, which is infinitely slower than your calls. And so that's the reason why you need to run asynchronous program, and kind of making it easy to go is by using async awaits. It's out of scope to explain that this is syntactic sugar and how promises work and more, but that's what's going on there. So what we need in this request JWT user token call is that integration key that we defined above, which is, defining that, yeah, this is Tally Customer Portals application. The impersonated user GUID, which is actually my user ID. The scopes, which is defining which APIs I have access to, which is just going to be signature. And then private key, which is that RSA private key. And this last number here is the number of seconds before expiration. That's actually, like I said, seconds, it's actually 1 hour. Json Web Tokens are actually only going to be valid for 1 hour. And you don't have a refresh token involved. So what will happen is, after an hour, will no longer work and you'll want to rerun this call to be able to have a fresh token. Whereas an authorization code grant, it lasts for 8 hours and there's a refresh token that lasts for 30 days. But the trade-off is that outside of that window, you'll have to have a constant login with a user and a password, and sort of like a redirect window of this to open to use that response code to generate the call, the access token. All right, following me? Awesome. So let's go in here. We have our data. So let's go ahead and pipe out that data. So the response, we're just showing the response body within the window here. And then we're going to take the, and these things were just things I found through trial and error and having to pick and hunt the API. I didn't just know them and recall them. So we're setting the expiry, which is when the token will expire in, and I believe this is in seconds. So this is going to also say 3600, and this is going to be the access token. And then we're actually on top of, we're saving these to local variables, but on top of that, we're going to return these. And we're doing this that way because this ultimately is going to be designed to where it can be used modularly as well. So that's everything, right? We're good to go. We're done, right? We can get lunch. Yeah? No? Okay. So yeah, we actually can't because there's a couple of issues still. Like I said, you actually still need to click authorization consent, and this doesn't account for that. So now let's account for that, shall we? And so rather than kind of signing out, I'm going to paste this here, but I'm going to kind of go into details on what everything is all happening, right? So catch error, right? If error response. So before actually checking the response body to see if there's any sort of response output, let's see if like the response exists. And we're doing this because if there's a problem with the private key or something else within the system, this will account for that. And you won't be scratching your head wondering, well, what's wrong? So we got a response back, right? Now let's look in the response body's error text and see if consent is required. And that's the standard output that will be returned when using this authorization consent mechanism. And so like if the consent is still required. And so with that being there, if that's the case, let's go ahead and put out in the window, yeah, the consent is required. Let's give them the consent URL, and let's go ahead and just use this open module to open it for them. So that's what we'll be doing. So that's good to go. And then we exit the code because there's no reason to try to run further API calls. And that is now done, right? Close, but we actually still do need to account for this, right? Any other errors that might be legitimate errors. So let's else, right? And then we're going to use this just console error and exit it like so. All right, so this function is now good to go. So let's go ahead and fill in the second user info function. And this part right here is actually working on getting the access token, but there's actually a second part here. And that second part's that you're going to need to have an API account ID. And let's go ahead and take a look. Sorry, let's find it here. Let's look at this. This is the API Explorer. So ultimately, you'll want to use this. Sorry, it's the API reference, and there's also a built-in Explorer as well. You'll want to use this to kind of look up different things and figure out where you're going with and how you're going to build out your integration after the getting of the access tokens, if you will. And so what you'll notice here, if you look at these, is that the account ID is required in all of these different calls. I call it a required path parameter. Once you have that account ID, at a later point, you're going to probably need to be running an get envelope status call to be able to get a list of envelope IDs, right? And so I'm not going to go into the steps of doing this. I do have this in the demo that I'm going to be giving to you later, so you will be able to review that though. I will be going over how to get this account ID though. This account ID again was that API account ID here. You have to presume that this is not going to be available because you may actually have multiple accounts across different across different tenants, right? You may have like different members and different accounts. And so that's why what we're ultimately trying to grab is the API account ID using the user ID that we will know there will only be one unique record of. So we're going to be using this. And that's what that is. So to pull that API account ID, we need to use the user info call, and that's a get call. And it's actually called get user info in the SDK, just to make things very easy to remember for everyone. All right. So just as before, we're going to instantiate an API client and load in the OAuth base path to the demo base path. And just as simple as it was before, it'll be simple again. We're going to get user info, just like that. And we're actually going to pass in that access token that we had before. So you remember we saved it to a local variable. So that's how it's able to be reused that way. All right, so that's good to go. Let's, as before, we're just going to console log this data out. And we're going to also save it to a local variable, but we're also going to save it to like a return object as well for later. And I don't like labeling that error just because it's confusing. So that'll just happen if like there's a problem with this call. Let's respond out with that call. And that's pretty much everything I had for like the raw code. Now, how do we execute it, right? So what I'm doing in this style is I'm actually going to be, did I miss something? I'll figure out in a moment. Should be good. Okay, so yeah, what we're doing in this style of call is we're actually going to be using something called an Iife, which is an immediately invoking function expression. And that's just a fancy way of saying that whenever I run this code, anything that's in this will run. Like press the button, this will run. And so to run this, let's go ahead and bring it in. So we're going to go await, because remember we were using async awaits, and we want to make sure to await for DocuSign .get JWT, right? And then await es .get user info, right? Just like that. Let's try to run it. So let's go node index.js. Okay, nice. Let's see. So unexpected end of input. So something somewhere probably has an extra semicolon. That works. All right, and then, okay, so I think that was it right there, right? So see, that closes that, but we actually aren't closing the function, so that's what we're missing. So now we've closed the function. Okay, so it's good to go. Let's try this again. You can see it's taking a bit of time, right? So That's the reason why I needed to use the async awaits, because the second call might run and the data won't even actually get back to us. And so that's would be what we would be waiting for. Oh, look at that. Awesome. So this is the first time user consent authorization that happens. Let's go ahead and read what this is happening. This is really important before clicking accept on these sort of things. You always want to read these things. So create and send envelopes, obtain links for creating signing sessions. So that's from the signature scope, e-signature. And this one says this account will be permitted to request access to your account without you being present. So that's that impersonation scope that I mentioned earlier. And that's not important to mention within JWT itself. And the reason for that is because JWT implies that you're acting on behalf of that user. However, within that consent URL, you do need to specify when initiating it that, yeah, this is going to be a JWT style of access token that I want to be allowable from this account. So let's go ahead and click accept. And as you saw before, there actually an authorization code does come along. If you were using authorization code grant at this step, you would be using this code in a subsequent API call. However, since we're using JWT, you can ignore this, so just close it. It's not important. So since we've granted consent, let's go ahead and try this again. Right. So we're going to run it once more. Okay. Let's see, what am I looking at on time? Oh, interesting. So you see, we got our token, right? And it's returned, but we have an error here. Access tokens required. What's that about? Let's take a look. So, So you see right here, we actually had this as a required argument of a required parameter, this access token, but it looks like I didn't actually fill it in here. And so it's been saved, but I actually do need to specify that. So let's go ahead and put that in there, right? And then now let's run the code once more. And as you can see, I wasn't given a consent authorization window. I also wanted to point out that when I ran this code a second time, it's actually a different access token. So you can see the last of this is different from the last of that because indeed I ran the function different times and it's a different access token. Now this time, since I did correctly pass in the call, this is the user info response that came back from the API. You'll see this is the account that I created with you here during this demo, along with the account name, that base path, and this is the API account ID for that user. Let's go ahead and match that and verify that's the case, right? Yep, it's the same. And so you will be using this within that path on the Explorer for account IDs, as you'll see, and that's what will be needed as a prerequisite to kind of get going. Let's see, I'm at 11:18. Let's see, was that everything? Let's see where I'm at on time. 10 minutes training. Oh, wow, brilliant. Yes. I was worried about running over, to be honest. All right, so since we're here, I'm going to go ahead and take one more quick moment to discuss the modularity concept of this. And so ultimately, what you're seeing here is a way to kind of run this code within itself as like its own functioning thing to run it as node index. But a real application is going to have like folders and dozens or hundreds of different JavaScript files or whatever. It could be a PHP project or a Ruby project. It could be anything. Like this same concept does carry over to any of the different programming languages you might use. What is nice about our SDKs is they're actually all compiled from an open API specification Swagger file. And so that Swagger file will have the same method names across. It may be snake or camel case, depending on what the common convention is. But ultimately, it's going to have the same method names. And those method names can be found as well also in this API Explorer, which I really implore you to check out. It's a wonderful resource. Phil and Eleanor do a great job of maintaining it. Those are members on our team as well. Right, so modularity. Ultimately, what you may want to do instead of having this immediately invoking function is you may want to do something like this where you go module exports. And so you're not wondering like me typing it out and fumbling with it, I'll just take what I had. So it'll look like this, right? And then from there, instead of kind of running node index, you may run like node, and we're just kind of doing it in the REPL style, right? So we want to go let yes equal require, right? Index.js. Right? And so that's now imported this, and ultimately from there, what we could do, right, for example, is we could go DocuSign, get JWT, right? And then instead of kind of doing async awaits because we're doing it live, we're going to do it like a promise chain because these all function with promises under the hood. So we'll take the response output from that and call it done, and then we'll basically pipe it out to the console window to show that access token. So let's try it. Did I miss something? Oh yeah, I did miss something because I actually should have said equals to, right? Yeah. I'm not gonna really worry about it too much. Yeah, let's see what I'm at on time. But I'm happy to kind of answer any questions we may have. Yeah, questions or comments? Let's see, error catch block. Oh, thanks. Thanks. Okay, is there a way to know if is there a way to know when a token will expire if the start time is unknown? So not necessarily, because the time and expiration that's given is just literally like a amount of seconds, like a raw amount of seconds back. So you're going to want to actually have that timestamp that'll happen when the API call occurs. You could set up logging to do that as well. Typically, what would have happened though in real architecture would have been that you would have ultimately had saved that access token and that expiry in some sort of record somewhere, and the action of doing that in and of itself would have generated that timestamp. So that's my response to that. Do you need an actual developer to assist with this if you are an organization admin? No. I mean, I guess it's still the same level barrier to entry. Either way, you don't need to be a specific organization admin to have that. You do need to have access to use that implementation, though. Is there a solution for OAuth with the SOAP API? Let's see. Not at this time. Okay. Let's see. What do you use for auth? Is it a custom solution? No. So that's a great question. It's kind of context dependent on the SDK that's being used. For the Node SDK, we're using Passport 2, I believe, for OAuth 2. For Spring Boot in Java, we're using the Spring Boot security module that comes standard with that. So it's dependent, it's specifically dependent on what's the popular OAuth library that's being used. That's kind of the industry standard, and that's what will be used within our implementations of the API through what you see as the quick starts and as the sample apps. All right. Brilliant. Right. Talked about JSON Web Tokens in detail, and we talked about the demo on GitHub. Yeah, so I mean, I think that pretty much covers it. So I appreciate everybody's time here today. We are also going to be doing a different Ask Me Anything session immediately after. So if you have other questions or details, or maybe you want to go over other authentication concepts, I'm also happy to do that there as well. All right. I appreciate everybody here and everybody coming out and coming to my talk. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your time here today.